At dinner that night in my father's house, the air was heavy with the smell of beef stew and stale whiskey, the kind of mixture that clung to the walls and seeped into your skin. The old wooden table was crowded with plates, silverware clinking faintly as my mother tried to serve in silence, her hands trembling the way they always did when my father had already had too much to drink. My brother Mark sat across from me, his eyes darting nervously between us, chewing quickly as if he wanted the meal to end before the storm began. I had been waiting for this dinner, foolishly thinking that maybe sharing some good news might soften the hardness that seemed to live permanently in my father's face. I had worked years to prove myself through nights of study, endless hours at a job that rarely offered praise, and at last a promotion that meant stability, independence, and a chance to break free from the shadow of his constant criticism. So I took a deep breath and began trying to keep my voice steady. "Dad," I said, "I got promoted today." My words hovered above the table, fragile and hopeful. For a split second, I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes, but it was gone before it could become recognition. He leaned back in his chair, his thick fingers wrapped around the base of a half-empty glass of whiskey, and in that silence I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, each second louder than the last. Then it happened. With a sudden, violent motion, he hurled the glass straight at me. It hit the table first, shattering shards spraying across my plate liquid, splashing against my clothes, and a sharp sting on my arm where a piece grazed my skin. The sound was like thunder cracking inside the small kitchen. My mother gasped but did not move. Mark froze with his fork mid-air, and my father's voice roared over all of it. "You are a loser." The words slammed into me harder than the glass. His face was red veins pushing against his temples, his mouth twisted with fury. "A loser!" He spat it like poison, like it was the only truth he had ever believed about me. The room blurred for a moment as tears threatened, but I would not give him that satisfaction. I sat frozen, my heart pounding against my ribs, the metallic taste of fear and humiliation in my mouth. My brother slowly lowered his fork, his eyes narrowing with a hint of pity that stung almost as much as my father's words. My mother pressed her lips tight, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of her chair, but she stayed silent. The silence told its own story, the silence of years of submission, of looking away, of pretending the monster at the table was only a man having a bad day. My ears rang with the echo of loser repeating in my head until I thought I might scream, but I did not. I stared back at him, my father, the man who had controlled every step of my life with fists and words sharper than knives. And in that moment, something inside me hardened. I did not shout back. I did not rise. I let the insult sink deep where it could never leave, where it would turn from wound to weapon. The glass was still dripping whiskey down the table edge, the shards glittering like tiny daggers under the dim kitchen light, and I knew that something had broken beyond repair. That dinner changed everything. The fear that had defined me shifted into something else, something colder and sharper. My father thought he had silenced me with humiliation, but he had only lit a fuse I would no longer extinguish. The house where that dinner had taken place had stood for more than 40 years, a modest two-story home in Ohio with peeling white paint and shutters that creaked in the wind. It was the kind of house that might have felt comforting to a stranger, but to me it carried the weight of every cruel word and every slammed door. The living room smelled faintly of old leather and dust, the walls lined with family pictures that painted a false story. Snapshots of smiles that never lasted beyond the flash of the camera. On the mantel was a framed photo of my father holding Mark at a baseball game, his broad grin proud and warm, while in another picture of me at my high school graduation, his face looked distracted, almost annoyed, as if he had been forced into the moment. My father Richard was 62, a man whose body bore the strength of decades of construction work, but whose spirit had been corroded by whiskey bitterness and the need to control. His hands, large and calloused, had built houses and repaired roofs, yet they had also left bruises both on walls he punched in drunken rage and on the people who dared cross him. He was the kind of man who demanded respect without earning it, who thought fear was the same as love. He saw obedience as proof of loyalty, and he expected his family to orbit him like planets around a sun that had long since gone cold. My mother Linda sat at the dinner table that night with her eyes fixed on the food, her shoulders rounded inward, like someone always trying to make herself smaller and visible. She had spent her entire adult life under Richard's rule, moving between silence and survival. There had been a time when she was vibrant singing while she cooked, laughing with neighbors, but those days were long buried. Now she existed in this narrow space between his moods, careful never to provoke his wrath. Careful to keep the house tidy, the meals hot, the bills paid with whatever scraps of money he allowed. She had no independence, no voice, and when the glass shattered at the table, her only instinct was to shrink further into herself. My brother Mark, 5 years older than me, had learned a different survival strategy. He aligned himself with our father, echoing his judgments, mirroring his arrogance, because in return, he was rewarded with approval. Mark was the golden child, the heir, the one who could do no wrong. Richard gave him money to start small businesses, bailed him out when they failed, and praised his every minor success as though he were destined for greatness. In truth, Mark was weak dependent, but he wore my father's favoritism like armor, and it made him cruel in quieter ways. He would smirk when I was scolded, shrug when I was hit, and remind me later that resistance was pointless. And then there was me, Emily, 30 years old, sitting at that table with my carefully ironed blouse and a folder of work papers waiting in my car because I had planned to finish a report after dinner. I had fought my way through college with scholarships, juggling part-time jobs, surviving on instant noodles, and still my father had called me a failure. I had spent years climbing at work, staying late, taking assignments no one else wanted, and finally I had reached a point where I was respected. I had thought perhaps naively that sharing the news of my promotion might mend something between us. Instead, it had triggered his rage as though my independence was an insult he could not tolerate. The house around us felt like a prison of memory, each creak of the floorboards reminding me of nights when I had hidden in my room listening to arguments explode downstairs. The kitchen light hummed faintly, the yellow glow exposing the cracks in the plaster, the worn linoleum, and in that environment, everything felt trapped in time. My father still clung to authority he no longer deserved. My mother clung to silence, Mark clung to favoritism, and I was caught between wanting their love and knowing it would never come. The dinner table itself was a battlefield of sorts. My father at the head gripping his glass like a scepter, Mark beside him smirking with approval. My mother quietly serving like a servant rather than a wife, and me seated at the far side, trying to hold myself with dignity that no one in that house wanted to see. Even the details of that evening, the chipped plates, the silverware that had lost its shine, the faded floral curtains over the kitchen window seemed to emphasize how stagnant everything was. Nothing had changed in that house except me, and my father hated that. He hated that I had escaped his grip long enough to build something on my own, and when I dared to share that triumph, it was as if I had threatened the entire system of control he had spent his life constructing. For years, he had told me I would never amount to anything, that I was weak, that women could not survive without men. He had dismissed every milestone in my life, every achievement, twisting them into failures. When I graduated from college, he had sneered that I was wasting time. When I got my first apartment, he had said I would come crawling back within months. Even when I bought my own car, paying every dollar from my savings, he had mocked it as cheap, not worth bragging about. That night at dinner, all of that history sat heavy between us. My mother's silence was not neutral, it was complicity, and my brother's smirk was not indifference, it was betrayal. I realized as I sat there with whiskey dripping from the edge of the table that I was alone in that room, truly alone, and that realization burned almost as much as the insult. Yet beneath the humiliation was something new, something simmering. I was no longer a child, desperate for his approval. I was a woman who had fought her way into independence, and the house that had once caged me no longer defined me. In that setup in that room filled with broken dynamics, I felt a clarity I had never felt before. What had begun as another cruel dinner would become the turning point of my life. The glass had shattered. The word loser had been spat at me with venom, and yet the evening was only beginning to unravel. My father leaned back in his chair after his outburst, chest heaving as though he had accomplished some final act of authority, while I sat frozen, my clothes damp with whiskey, a tiny cut on my arm throbbing with every beat of my heart. My mother shifted in her chair, whispering a faint, "Oh, Richard," as though that would smooth the violence from the air, but she did not dare rise. Mark smirked faintly, not because he enjoyed the sight of blood, but because he understood what this display meant. It meant he was once again the favored one, the safe one, the one who had never been the target of flying glass or venomous words. He leaned back, crossed his arms, and in his silence, he let me know that siding with our father had always been his way to survive, even if it meant abandoning me. I swallowed the lump in my throat, tasting salt and iron, and tried to steady my breathing. I had spoken no further words, but my father was not done. He jabbed a thick finger across the table toward me. "You come in here with your big talk about a promotion like that means anything," he barked. "You think you are better than us 'cause you sit at a desk in some office. All I see is a little girl who never learned her place." The words tore at me, but I kept my face blank. Inside, however, a storm was rising. My mother finally spoke, her voice trembling. "Please, Richard, she is just telling you good news. Can we not just eat in peace?" He whipped his head toward her, eyes blazing, and snarled, "Stay out of this, Linda, you spoil her with your coddling. She should be grateful she has a roof over her head." The knife cut deeper than the glass because I did not live under his roof. I paid for my own apartment, my own bills, yet, in his mind, I would always be a dependent child, never free of his shadow. Mark cleared his throat, pushing his plate away with a clatter, and added fuel. "Dad is right, Emily," he said with a shrug. "You act like this promotion makes you somebody, but we all know who does the real work in this family. Dad broke his back for us, and you never respected him." The hypocrisy made my hands tremble under the table, because I knew it was me who had fought alone, me who had carried my own weight, while Mark had stumbled from one failed venture to another with Dad covering his debts. Yet here he was, twisting the story to fit the narrative that always painted me as the ungrateful one. My father slammed his palm on the table, the plates rattling. "That is right, Mark," he bellowed. "At least you know loyalty." "This one," he pointed at me with disgust, "this one thinks she is too good for us. Too good for her family." He spit the last word like it was an insult, and suddenly I realized this was not just about me. It was about control, the control he had always demanded, the control slipping through his fingers now that I had carved a life of my own. My pulse raced, but I refused to break. I lifted my chin slightly, my eyes locking on his, and for a fleeting second the rage in his eyes flickered into something else, something like fear, before it hardened again. He pushed his chair back abruptly, the screech of wood against tile filling the room, and stood towering over us. "You will always be nothing without me," he growled, his voice thick with drink and fury. "You are a failure, and no matter what you think you have achieved, you are still the same useless girl who could not even stand up to me." My mother covered her mouth, tears welling but no words coming, paralyzed by years of habit. Mark muttered under his breath, "You should not have provoked him, Emily." I wanted to scream at both of them, to shake them, to demand why they always excused his violence, why they had let him dictate our lives. But I stayed silent, my fingernails pressing half-moons into my palms under the table, my silence louder than any scream. The weight of the broken glass, the sting of humiliation, the betrayal in the eyes of my own brother, the cowardice of my mother, all of it pressed into me until something inside crystallized. The conflict at that table was not just a single outburst, it was decades of patterns, decades of being silenced, dismissed, and beaten down. That night was not new. It was only the latest chapter in a book I had been forced to live in, but as I stared into my father's furious face, I knew this chapter would not end like the others. The old me would have left the table in tears, retreated to her car, driven home, shaking and broken. But the woman sitting there now felt a shift, subtle but unstoppable. My father's roar was the sound of a crumbling empire, and though he did not realize it yet, he had already lost. The dinner was supposed to be just another night of dominance for him, but in his violence and in his words, he had given me something unexpected. He had given me clarity. He had given me the fuel to transform. I let the silence settle once more, shards of glass glittering between us, and then I rose quietly from my chair. The legs scraped the floor gently, almost polite in stark contrast to his earlier rage. I looked him in the eye and said nothing, but my gaze was enough. Then I walked away from the table, from the stew, from the fragments of a family that had never truly been whole. As I stepped out into the night air, cool against my skin, I knew the conflict was no longer his game. It was mine. Walking out into the night after that dinner, the cool Ohio air hit me like a slap, sharp and bracing, and in that silence the memories began to unspool, whether I wanted them to or not. I had walked away from the table many times before, but this time felt different because this time the past came flooding back with a force that nearly brought me to my knees. I remembered being a little girl, no more than 7 years old, sitting on the same kitchen floor that now lay littered with shards of glass hiding beneath the table as my father raged at my mother over a late bill. His voice boomed, his fists pounded the wall, and I had pressed my hands over my ears to block it out, though no matter how tightly I pressed, the fear still seeped in. I remembered him finding me under that table, his eyes bloodshot, his breath heavy with alcohol, yanking me out by my wrist and telling me never to cower, never to shame him by acting weak. That was his lesson, that weakness was a crime, yet he had built his entire kingdom on our fear. I remembered being 12 and dreaming of joining the school choir, my heart full of excitement, until he told me it was a waste of time and that I would be better off scrubbing the porch. I obeyed because obedience meant survival. My mother had looked at me with sorrow in her eyes, but had not spoken up because her silence was the shield that kept her standing. At 16, I had saved money from babysitting to buy myself a second-hand dress for the homecoming dance. I had been so proud when I showed it to my mother, but my father saw it, ripped it from my hands, and threw it into the fireplace, declaring that no daughter of his would prance around like a cheap girl. I cried in my room for hours that night, but when I finally looked in the mirror, I vowed I would never let him decide who I was. That vow was buried beneath years of more humiliations, but it was not gone. At 18, I received my college acceptance letter, a moment I had worked tirelessly for nights of studying by the dim glow of a desk lamp while my father mocked me for wasting electricity. When I showed him the letter, he laughed a bitter, sharp sound and told me I would fail before the first semester ended. He refused to attend the ceremony when I graduated, choosing instead to spend the day at a bar with Mark. My mother had come quietly, tears in her eyes, telling me she was proud, but even then I could see how guilt kept her chained. During my college years, there were nights when I had to choose between books and food nights when I lived on instant noodles, and yet I endured because each test I passed felt like defiance. Each paper turned in was another brick in the wall I was building between me and him. Still, his shadow stretched long. He would call me not to congratulate me, but to remind me that I owed everything to him, that the roof I had grown up under, the food in my belly as a child, all were reasons I could never escape his grip. Mark, meanwhile, stumbled from one failed venture to another, opening a small auto shop with Dad's money, letting it collapse, then trying a landscaping business, failing again, but every time Dad was there to bail him out. And every time I succeeded, every time I brought home an award, a certificate, even a simple paycheck, it was dismissed, minimized, called luck or meaningless. I remembered my first apartment, the pride I felt signing the lease, hanging curtains, arranging second-hand furniture. But when Dad came to see it, he sneered, said it smelled like mildew, said no man would ever want to live with me in such a place. He left me standing in the doorway with that bitter taste of shame he so easily stirred. I remembered birthdays when Mark got expensive gifts, baseball gloves, new shoes, while I got hand-me-downs or nothing at all. I remembered Christmas mornings when Dad drank too much and ended the day shouting that we were ungrateful, his words slicing through the holiday lights until they seemed dimmer. I remembered the worst moment when I was 21, and I told him I had been offered an internship at a company downtown, something that could set the course of my career. He looked at me with disgust and said, no daughter of his would work for strangers when there was family to take care of. He shoved me against the wall, his hand pressing my shoulder hard enough to bruise, and told me I would regret betraying him. I went anyway, and though it was the hardest summer of my life, it was also the one that gave me the foundation to build my career. The bruise faded, but the memory never did. Each flashback blended into the next, a collage of pain and survival, but also of defiance in small ways. Hiding library books under my pillow so he would not see I was still studying. Working double shifts in secret to save enough for my car. Filling out applications for scholarships when he said there was no point. Each act of resistance had been a seed planted seeds that had taken years to sprout, but now they formed the roots of the woman I had become. As I walked away from that dinner, I realized those memories no longer just hurt, they fueled me. They painted the picture of a man who had tried to crush me, and a woman who had learned to rise despite him. The flashbacks were not just shadows of the past, they were proof of my endurance, and they whispered to me that the time had come to stop enduring and start fighting. Every insult, every slap, every dismissal had been ammunition, and now I was ready to use it. My father thought he knew me, thought I was still the girl under the table, cowering in fear. He had no idea who I had become, no idea how his cruelty had forged something unbreakable in me. The past had been his weapon, but it was about to become mine. The night after that dinner stretched long and sleepless, every tick of the clock in my small apartment sounding like a hammer against my skull. I sat on the balcony with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, the cool autumn wind lifting strands of my hair, my eyes fixed on the scattered stars that dotted the Ohio sky. My clothes still smelled faintly of whiskey, a reminder of the glass that had shattered, of the humiliation that still burned fresh. For hours, I replayed his words in my head. Loser, failure, nothing without me, each insult echoing until it felt like the walls themselves were repeating his verdict. My first instinct had been to cry, to curl up and let the tears run until I was emptied of them, but something inside me refused. The tears came, but they did not bring weakness. Instead, they sharpened me, and when they dried on my cheeks, the sharpness remained like the edge of a blade newly honed. I thought of my mother, her silence at the table, the way her lips pressed into a thin line as though swallowing her own voice, and I realized she might never escape. I thought of Mark smirking with his half-truths and borrowed strength, too content to be a puppet so long as the strings brought him benefits. And then I thought of myself 30 years old, standing alone but not broken, and I asked the question I had never dared before. Why should I let him win? For years I had believed his lies, even while proving them wrong. I had carried them like stones in my pocket, heavy and unrelenting. But now, sitting in the stillness of night, I felt those stones slipping from my grasp. I was not powerless. I was not the girl hiding beneath the table. I was not the failure he wanted me to be. I had built a life with my own hands, a career, a home, a future, and he had no claim to it. The stars above seemed to wink with approval as I whispered aloud, barely more than a breath, "I am done." The words hung in the air, fragile yet fierce, and I knew they marked a shift that could not be undone. Done with his control, done with his violence, done with letting him define me. My father had drawn a line with his glass and his words, but I would redraw it in stone, and this time it would be me deciding where it stood. I sat there until the horizon began to pale, with the approach of dawn, the world awakening while my resolve solidified. I remembered every sacrifice I had made, every late night at the office, every paycheck carefully saved, every small victory won without his help. He had never seen those moments as triumphs, but I did, and now I would use them. The thought of retaliation once would have scared me. The thought of standing against him seemed impossible, but now it burned inside me with the inevitability of sunrise. I would not lash out in anger as he had. I would not throw glasses or scream insults. I would not meet violence with violence. No, my revenge would be quiet, deliberate, intelligent, and undeniable. I pictured his face when the control slipped, when his empire of fear began to crumble, and instead of fear, I felt something close to peace. The turning point was not loud or dramatic. It was silent and certain. It was the moment I chose to fight differently. I picked up a notebook from my desk, its pages blank and waiting, and began to write. I wrote down every instance of abuse I could remember, dates, times, events, witnesses. I wrote down the times he had hit my mother, the times he had shoved me, the threats he had hurled in drunken rages. I wrote down the debts he had covered for Mark, The suspicious money that passed through his hands, the jobs he had abandoned while still collecting cash under the table. The pen scratched across paper furiously, and with each word I felt the past transforming from wound to weapon. By the time the sun broke fully over the horizon, my notebook was half filled and my mind was clear. The plan was not yet complete, but the foundation had been laid. I would gather evidence, I would build a case, and I would show him that the daughter he had dismissed as worthless was capable of dismantling him with nothing more than truth. I closed the notebook with a finality that made my heart pound, set it on the desk, and stood before the mirror. My reflection looked back at me, tired eyes swollen from tears, but beneath that, I saw something new. Strength, defiance, resolve. For the first time in my life, I was not afraid of him. He had shown me his worst, and I had survived it. Now I would show him mine, and he would not survive unscathed. That was the night the balance shifted. That was the night the victim died and the fighter was born. The morning after that long night of riding, I woke with a new kind of energy coursing through me, the kind that comes not from rest, but from resolve. The air felt sharper, the light through the blinds brighter, and even the silence of my apartment hummed with purpose. I opened the notebook again, running my hand over the pages where I had poured out years of memories, and I knew it was time to turn them into action. For so long, my father had been the one holding the reins, deciding who spoke, who stayed silent, who thrived, who crumbled. That control was about to end. The first step was information. I contacted a lawyer, a woman named Karen, who had been recommended by a colleague at work. Her office smelled faintly of coffee and fresh paper, and she listened quietly as I laid out the history. I expected skepticism, perhaps pity, but instead I saw in her eyes the steady gleam of someone who understood both the law and the ugliness that people hid behind closed doors. She asked precise questions about dates, about witnesses, about evidence, and I handed her the notebook. She nodded slowly, flipping through, then said, "You have more than you think. Abuse, financial mismanagement, possible fraud. If we gather documentation, he will not withstand scrutiny." My chest tightened, not with fear, but with vindication. The path was real, and I was not walking it alone. Over the next weeks, I moved with quiet calculation. After work, I drove by the house under the pretense of visiting my mother, but my real intent was to observe, to note patterns. I saw the bottles of whiskey piling in the recycling bin, the neighbors who looked away when he shouted late at night the way Mark came and went with boxes he never explained. I started speaking to those neighbors discreetly, not pressing, but asking simple questions, and some of them opened up. Yes, they had heard the shouting. Yes, they had seen me or my mother crying. Yes, they would be willing to sign statements if asked. I gathered these like puzzle pieces, each one fitting into the picture I was building. My mother was harder. Years of fear had made her cautious, but slowly I began to plant seeds. I brought her groceries, spent time sitting with her in the kitchen, and gently mentioned that she deserved better, that she had rights. At first, she shook her head, whispering, "It is easier not to fight, Emily. You do not understand." But I did understand. I had lived that silence too. I showed her small pieces of what I had learned, hinted at the possibility of freedom, and I saw flickers of hope she tried to hide. I knew I would need her testimony, her courage, and I was patient, giving her time to let the idea take root. Meanwhile, I pulled financial records. My father was careless with paperwork, often leaving bills and receipts scattered on the counter. During one visit while he dozed in front of the television, I slipped a stack of envelopes into my bag. Later at home, I sifted through them and found exactly what I suspected: overdue credit cards, strange withdrawals, payments made under different names. I took copies to Karen, who examined them with sharp eyes and said, "This is the thread we pull. If he has been hiding income or dodging taxes, it will unravel quickly." My father's pride had always been his work, his claim that he provided, that he built a home with his own sweat. Exposing the rot beneath that pride would not only strip his control, but destroy the image he clung to. Still, legal avenues were only part of the plan. I knew the court of public opinion mattered too, especially in a small town where reputations were currency. I contacted an old friend from college, a journalist now working for a local paper. Her name was Sarah, and when I told her the broad strokes, she leaned forward, notebook ready, her eyes alight with curiosity and determination. Domestic abuse, financial fraud, a respected man with a crumbling facade, she saw the story immediately. We agreed to proceed carefully, waiting until the evidence was solid, but knowing that when the moment came, the truth would explode across the community in ink and headlines. Each step I took felt like moving pieces on a chessboard. My father did not suspect continuing his blustering routines, unaware that the ground beneath him was cracking. Mark noticed something, though. One evening, he confronted me in the driveway as I left the house. "Why are you here so much?" he asked, his tone suspicious. "Dad does not need you snooping around." I looked him straight in the eye and said calmly, "Maybe he does not need me, but Mom does." The flicker of guilt that passed across his face told me he knew the truth, though he would never admit it. He muttered something about family loyalty and walked away, but I saw the unease in his shoulders. That unease was a small victory. As the weeks passed, my notebook grew thick with additions. Dates receipts, witness names, details of every outburst. I documented with the precision of an accountant, knowing that each line was a brick in the wall I was building against him. Karen began drafting filings, preparing for the legal storm, while Sarah outlined the framework of the article that would bring everything into the light. My mother slowly, painfully began to shift. One evening, as I sat with her, she reached for my hand and whispered, "Emily, if I speak, will it really change anything?" My eyes burned with tears, and I squeezed her hand. "Yes, Mom, it will change everything." That was the moment I knew she would stand with me. The plan grew bolder then. We arranged for police involvement, ensuring that when the time came, when the confrontation was public, there would be no escape. I rehearsed it in my mind, over and over, the gathering, the evidence, the unveiling. My father had built his world on fear and silence, but I would shatter it with truth and law. The execution was not impulsive, it was careful, methodical. Every step was designed to ensure that when the collapse came, it would be complete. Yet even as I plotted, there were moments of doubt, flashes of the child inside me who had once hidden under the table, who still flinched at raised voices. But each time those doubts rose, I returned to the memory of the glass shattering of the word loser, of the humiliation that had burned like fire. That memory steeled me, reminded me that there was no turning back. The woman I was now had no room for fear. I could see the endgame approaching. My father, sitting smug at the head of the table, still believed he held power. He had no idea the web tightening around him, no idea that his own daughter was orchestrating the undoing he thought impossible. Soon, the truth would not just whisper in my notebook or in my lawyer's office. Soon, it would roar, undeniable and public. And when it did, he would face the reckoning he had spent a lifetime avoiding. I closed my notebook one last time, placed it in my bag, and felt the weight of it like a weapon. The plan was ready. The pieces were in place. The execution had begun. The night of the family gathering arrived like a storm I had been tracking for weeks, inevitable and electric. My father had decided to host a dinner for extended relatives, cousins, and uncles, and a few neighbors, a performance of stability and control that he always enjoyed. He wore his best flannel shirt, pressed and clean, and sat at the head of the table as though he were king of some small kingdom. My mother moved silently through the kitchen, setting out dishes of roast chicken and mashed potatoes, her face pale, but her eyes meeting mine briefly with a flicker of courage. Mark lounged at his father's right side, his expression smug, confident that the hierarchy was intact. I took my seat quietly, heart pounding, but face composed my bag beside me, heavy with the documents and copies that would end the charade. The air smelled of food and smoke from the fireplace, but underneath it I sensed tension like static before lightning. Conversation buzzed at first, relatives chatting about weather and work until my father, his voice booming with whiskey confidence, steered the talk toward himself. He bragged of years in construction, of sacrifices he had made for his family, of loyalty and tradition. Each word was a hammer trying to nail down the story he wanted the world to believe. Then, as if unable to resist, he turned toward me. "Emily here," he said loudly, "thinks she is better than the family now. A desk job, a fancy promotion, and suddenly she forgets who gave her everything." He smirked, lifting his glass as chuckles rose from Mark and a few others too nervous to defy him. My stomach nodded, but instead of shrinking, I straightened. This was the moment. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick folder, laying it on the table with a sound that cut through the laughter. The room quieted. Forks paused midair, eyes turning to me. My voice was steady, though. Inside, my heart raced. "You want to talk about truth, Dad? Let's talk about truth." I opened the folder and spread out papers across the table. Bank statements overdue, bills, police reports, witness statements. The words on the pages gleamed under the light like weapons. My father's face flushed crimson, his smile vanishing. "What is this?" he barked, his voice rising. "Lies, nonsense." I met his gaze, unflinching. "These are records of your debts, evidence of your abuse testimony from neighbors who have heard you screaming at Mom, from people who have seen your violence. These are copies of financial transactions that show money disappearing, taxes unpaid. These are years of truth you tried to bury." Gasps filled the room, chairs scraping as relatives leaned forward to read, to see with their own eyes the reality I was laying bare. Mark reached for a paper, his face paling as he scanned it, muttering, "This cannot be right." My mother's hands trembled as she clutched a statement she knew was real, her lips parting as if finally finding her voice. My father stood abruptly, knocking his chair back with a crash. "You dare humiliate me in my own house!" he roared, his fists clenched. "You think a pile of papers means anything? You think you can challenge me?" His voice cracked with rage, but beneath it I heard the quiver of fear. He lunged forward as if to grab the documents, but before he could reach them, the front door opened and two uniformed officers stepped inside. Their presence was calm, authoritative, the result of the report I had filed and the timing carefully arranged with Karen. The chatter turned into stunned silence. "Mr. Richard," one officer said firmly, "we need you to step back. We have reason to believe crimes have been committed, and we are here to ensure the safety of everyone present." My father froze, his eyes darting between me, the officers, and the papers that betrayed him. His power drained from him visibly, his shoulders slumping even as he tried to rally. "This is my house!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "You have no right!" The officer held up a warrant, crisp and undeniable. "We do have the right. The law has the right. Please, sit down." Relatives whispered, eyes wide, some shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, others nodding in grim recognition of truths they had suspected. Mark rose half out of his chair, face twisted with confusion and betrayal. "Dad, what is going on?" he stammered, his voice smaller than I had ever heard it. My father glared at me, his eyes bloodshot, his mouth working as though to find words that would cut me down, but nothing came. The silence that followed was more powerful than any insult he had ever hurled. I gathered the paper slowly, methodically, and looked around the table. "For years we lived under his rule," I said, my voice ringing clear. "For years he controlled us with fear and lies. Tonight that ends. The truth is here, and it will not be buried again." My mother's eyes filled with tears, but this time she did not look away. She whispered, "Emily is right," and though her voice was soft, it carried the weight of decades of silence broken. The officers stepped forward, one gently taking my father's arm. He resisted for a moment, jerking back, but his struggle was weak, his body betraying the collapse of his authority. He shouted again, words tumbling incoherently, calling me ungrateful, calling me poison, but no one listened. The sound of his voice had lost its power. The image of him being led from the house, flanked by officers, his relatives staring in shock, was seared into my mind. It was not triumph that I felt, but release, as though a chain around my chest had finally snapped. Mark sank back into his chair, his face pale, avoiding my eyes. My mother reached for my hand, squeezing tightly, and for the first time I saw not fear, but relief in her expression. Around us, the family murmured, some sympathetic, some stunned, all aware that nothing would ever be the same. The climax of decades of control had come crashing down in one evening, shattered not with fists or glass, but with truth and courage. As the door closed behind the officers and my father's protests faded into the night, the room exhaled collectively. I stood tall, the folder still in my hand, and declared quietly, "The truth has exploded. No one spoke against me. No one could." In the days that followed the confrontation, the house that had once been my prison became the stage of my father's downfall. The neighbors whispered about the police cars that had pulled up that night, about the sight of Richard being led away in handcuffs, his face red with rage but powerless for the first time. The newspapers carried Sarah's article, bold headlines exposing decades of abuse, financial fraud, and the betrayal that had festered behind closed doors. My father's reputation as a hard-working man of the community collapsed overnight, his name now associated with police reports and court hearings. At work sites, his former colleagues shook their heads, some expressing shock, others admitting they had seen the signs all along. Mark struggled to hold himself together, his golden image tarnished by association. He avoided my calls, avoided even visiting my mother, and word spread that some of his small business dealings were being scrutinized as well. Without my father's protection, he was exposed, forced to stand on his own in a way he never had before. For the first time, he felt the weight I had carried for decades, and though part of me wanted to gloat, I felt only a distant pity. He had chosen loyalty to a tyrant, and now he bore the consequences. My mother, though fragile at first, began to change before my eyes. She no longer moved through the house with her shoulders hunched, no longer pressed her lips into silence. Instead, she spoke cautiously at first, then more freely, recounting stories of years when she had wanted to leave but had been too afraid. With Karen's guidance, she filed for legal separation, claiming her share of the assets my father had hoarded. For the first time in 40 years, she held her own bank account, her own name on documents that gave her independence. I watched her smile one morning as she held a debit card, simple plastic but radiant, in her trembling hands. "This is mine," she whispered, as if tasting freedom for the first time. The community reacted in waves. Some relatives distanced themselves, too uncomfortable to face the truth, preferring the easier lie that things had been exaggerated. Others reached out with compassion, offering support, offering to help my mother settle into a new life. The balance shifted in ways I had not expected, but I welcomed it. What mattered was that the silence had been broken. My father faced charges of domestic violence, financial fraud, and tax evasion. In court, he tried to bluster to call me a liar, to paint himself as a victim of an ungrateful daughter. But the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses testified, documents spoke louder than his denials, and even Mark, under pressure, admitted to knowing about debts and abuse. The verdict was clear. He was sentenced, not only stripped of his freedom, but of the illusion of control he had wielded for so long. I sat in the courtroom as the gavel struck my hands steady, my heart full of a strange mixture of grief and relief. Grief for the years stolen, relief for the justice finally served. Walking out into the bright sun that day, I felt lighter than I had ever felt before. The aftermath was not easy. The scars of the past did not vanish with his conviction. There were nights when I woke sweating from dreams of shouting, of fists slamming walls, of glasses shattering. There were days when I looked in the mirror and still heard his voice calling me a loser. But alongside those moments was something stronger, a voice of my own that said, "You are free now. You survived. You fought back." My mother and I moved forward together. We cleared out the old house, sorting through decades of clutter, discarding the relics of his control. The photographs on the wall, once symbols of false smiles, we boxed away. In their place, we hung new pictures, small but genuine, of my mother laughing in her garden of me, at my desk of simple dinners where no one shouted. One evening, sitting with her on the porch of her new apartment, she reached over and squeezed my hand. "You saved me, Emily," she said softly. I shook my head, tears filling my eyes. "No, Mom, you saved yourself. I only gave you the chance." As the seasons turned, I found myself healing in unexpected ways. At work, I felt more confident, no longer hiding my successes as though they might provoke punishment. With friends, I shared more openly, allowing them to see the depth of what I had endured. And in quiet moments alone, I allowed myself to feel pride, something I had long denied. The resolution was not about revenge, though justice had been served. It was about reclaiming the parts of myself I had buried under fear. It was about standing tall and knowing that the word loser no longer held power over me. My father had tried to define me with his rage, but in the end, it was his own downfall that defined him. The final image of him I carried was not of the man towering over me with fists clenched, but of him shrinking in a courtroom, powerless as the truth surrounded him. The truth had exploded, and it had freed me. On a cool evening months later, I stood outside, looking at the stars once again, the same stars that had witnessed my turning point. I breathed deeply, the air crisp, and whispered, "It is over." And for the first time, the words did not feel fragile. They felt like fact. The resolution was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new one. One built on strength, on freedom, on the unshakable knowledge that no matter what shadows the past cast, the future was mine to shape.